America's most remarkable historian on radio, I'm sure, is Webster Tarpley, and we're going to talk tonight about World War I, which took us to World War II, which essentially brought us to where we are today. It's all connected. Don't kid yourself. You all know that, or you wouldn't be listening. Webster, welcome back to the program.
Thank you very much, Jeff, and you're very right. We just have to remember that out of World War I comes fascism, communism, World War II, the Great Depression on the way, the Cold War, and here we are. And what you see going on in the Middle East, for example, or indeed in Ukraine and places like this, especially the Middle East part, comes directly from a treaty that was part of the Versailles settlement, the so-called Peace of Paris, 1919. Yeah. That's the Treaty of Sèvres, and that's the all of these secret agreements, right? People talk about the Sykes-Picot Agreement. Well, the way that was imposed on the world was the map that was set up as part of this Versailles haggling, and that was the Treaty of Sèvres, and that is why you have so much, what can we say, unworkable, dysfunctional border drawing that has been done. So it's absolutely critical. It's really the beginning of a world crisis that has scarcely ever relented, and which right now is getting worse. I think it might be worth talking about.
It certainly is. What's really fascinating, folks, and what Webster's going to talk about, and what I would urge you to do, is go look at a map of Europe and the Middle East before World War I, and look how the whole thing was redrawn after the war. It's really quite remarkable. Go ahead, please.
It's a group of treaties. Now let me see if I can remember these. Versailles is the one that often stands for the whole, but that's only Germany, and that's a rather draconian treaty. But then we have some others. The Treaty of Trianon. These are all Paris suburbs, right? You can call it the Paris suburban treaty settlement. It was dictated, of course.
Well, they're all siblings in a way, yeah.
So Trianon is Hungary, Neuilly is Bulgaria, Saint-Germain is Austria, and then we have Sèvres, which is the Ottoman Empire or Turkey.
Sykes-Picot was pretty much also known, wasn't it, as the Asia Minor Agreement or something?
But that's what's built into Sèvres. You see, that's where it comes from. Now, the interesting thing is also that nobody would have ever known about the Sykes-Picot Agreement for a very long time, were it not for the fact that the Bolsheviks, Trotsky, once he took over in Moscow, published the contents of the Tsarist secret archives and said, look at this dirty dealing, look what they're trying to do, and so forth, because there was a plan to give Russia various pieces of the Ottoman Empire, right, the traditional enemy. But I think we talked about this a little bit last time.
Yeah.
Maybe we can talk about it again. We've just had the anniversaries, right? We're right now passing through the 100th anniversary of the beginning of the actual shooting. I think last time we talked about the Sarajevo assassination, which is the detonator. That's June 28th, 1914. So we talked about the 100th anniversary of that. But then there's this dreamland month of July 1914, which is the subject of a number of novels and studies about how hundreds of millions of people can be completely deluded about what's going on. Now, naturally, having totally secret diplomacy helps, but we have totally secret diplomacy today as well, so that's not so different. Could be happening. I guess that's the other thing to bear in mind as we go through it, is remember that it gets to look more and more like what we've been going through since the Malaysian airliner in Ukraine, since the coup d'etat in Kiev back in February, right, the fascist government there, all of these things. So,
people, one more thing, Webster, then I'll get out of the way. People don't understand. They don't remember how many people died in World War I and were wounded.
It's probably about 25 million, except if you add in the influenza epidemic, which is probably a consequence of the economic warfare. You have to remember that Central Europe, Germany, Austria, Hungary, many of these places remained under a sea blockade by the British, and then with the help of the U.S. and, of course, the French. That kept going, right? Even when there was an armistice in November 1918, the sea blockade kept going.
Yeah.
So there was malnutrition and starvation in Germany and all of those other areas, and that was only lifted when they signed the Versailles Treaty. So it was extorted not only at gunpoint, but under the threat of death by starvation.
There was
a very ugly story.
Right. There was some talk about the possibility that this particular strain of flu was brought over to Europe by American soldiers from Kansas. That's rumbling around the perimeter. No one knows. Webster's right. 50 to 100 million people died of influenza. About 20 million dead in World War I in combat, and a number, around 15 million casualties in terms of injuries. So you got 20 million dead in combat, 50 to 100 million dead from the flu. That's mind-boggling.
You can also point out that the cultural impact, the cultural shock, is actually greater than World War II, if only because World War II comes later. The amount of horror that people had been exposed to, they had become somewhat numbed by the time you get World War II. But in 1914, you go from the time it's referred to in English, of course, as the good old days. In American parlance, the good old days means before 1914. For the French, it's la belle époque, right? The beautiful time, the beautiful period of history. So let us look at this. We just want to point out, though, that the big celebration, the big commemoration, I guess we'd say, was on August 3rd, a couple of days ago now, and that was the British and the Belgians decided to mark that as the beginning of the war. August 3rd is the day that the war actually begins in Belgium. In other words, the German army goes into Belgium under the Schlieffen Plan, and we can talk about that perhaps at the end. But I think there are other things that are less known. The day before yesterday, the British held this commemoration, which was based on turning out all the lights at 11 p.m. on the night of August 3rd. The British turned out all the lights in the Houses of Parliament. They have that Millennium Ferris wheel in downtown London, and many of the signs in Piccadilly Circus, I guess, were turned off. And this goes back to a guy we're going to talk about a lot tonight, Sir Edward Grey. Now, I sometimes call him Sir Edward Grey, Earl Grey,
the
T, yeah. Right? That's him. Or Viscount Grey, sometimes he's called. He can be called Lord Grey, too. But I think Earl Grey or Sir Edward Grey. This is the British foreign minister, and this is somebody who embodies a kind of hypocrisy and duplicity which seems to go beyond most public figures that you're likely to see in the last couple of hundred years. He's a monster of perfidy and deception, and he really, in some ways, the fact that this became a world war was his handiwork. So the British had cemeteries in Belgium at Ypres and Passchendaele, where so many millions were killed, and then they had some other events. So
millions,
we're just
folks.
coming
Millions.
out of this. Millions, sure. Verdun is there are parts of the Verdun battlefield where you get up to about 300 dead per square meter, right? So you can imagine what that means. 300 people killed for a square yard, more or less. That's a very, very extreme form. So
Earl
we got to think about this.
Grey lived to be about 80. He lived a very full. He didn't suffer. He lived a very full
about
life.
him. Here's the news, and this I would like to point this out. In the last week or 10 days, the British press, and this includes tabloids like the Daily Mail, but also halfway serious propaganda sheets like the London Daily Telegraph, which to me has always represented one of the main conduits of NATO intelligence in the world. There are some new documents, and I think this is a shock. Why don't we just try to treat this at the beginning, and then we put it in context. See, the idea with the British was that they were the most reluctant, right? Of course, they wanted peace. They didn't want war. They tried to mediate. They were trying to convince Germany and Austria-Hungary to pull back and avoid the worst. And we have this quote from Sir Edward Grey. He says, "The lights are going off across Europe." This is the evening of August 3rd, 1914. "The lights are going off across Europe, and we shall not see them again in our lifetime." Now, even this is tremendously hypocritical. They decided to make this the theme of their commemoration, right? To turn the lights off at 11 o'clock in the evening on August 3rd. But when the British say Europe, they mean something other than themselves, right? They mean the continent. What he's really saying is the lights are going off across the continent, and we won't see them turned on again in our lifetimes. This is actually a form of gloating, because what he's really saying is they're getting slammed, we are a different story. Remember, there's this famous joke, right, that one night the ferries and the boats across the English Channel from France to Britain and so forth, these are shut down by fog, and the headline in the British press the next day is, "Fog blocks the channel, continent isolated." Meaning that they think of themselves as the center of it, and Europe as a secondary thing.
That's pretty funny.
Even though, of course, the continent is much bigger. So look, here's the thing. Slightly. At the time that World War I started, the king was King George V. Now, as I show in my essay, which you can see at tarpley.net, I hope people will take a look. There's if you want to hear it presented as a speech, I have it there from 1995 at a conference where I go through the whole story of Edward VII and his son, then King George V, and how they are absolutely critical architects of World War I. And there's also an essay where it's all written up. But by the time we get to 1914, King Edward has died, right? He died as an old roue, right? As a playboy, and
haven't heard that word in years.
Sorry?
That's a great word. I haven't heard that in years.
An old roue, yeah, that's him. He is the old roue par excellence. So he died in 1910. He was smoking so many cigars and so many cigarettes that he had a kind of chronic bronchitis, what they call catarrh, and that seems to have eventually overstrained him, and
smoker's
he died.
Cough. He died.
Yeah, something like this. So his son is George V, but you have to remember that George V was not the eldest son. There was an elder brother, and that is this Prince Albert Victor Edward, who would have been the king, except that he died. He probably died of syphilis, as a number of top British people did at this point. But I just want to mention that according to quite a significant body of research, and serious research, it's King Edward's eldest son, the elder brother of King George V, is Jack the Ripper. He's the guy who goes around disemboweling prostitutes in Whitechapel. So when you look at the British monarchy, right, you've got Edward VII, the homicidal uncle of Europe, who's the guy who creates the alliance system, right? Britain, France, and Russia, to crush Germany and Austria, encircle them and surround them, and then defeat them. And then you've got his son, George V. We're going to learn right now what a villain this guy is. His son, of course, is Edward VIII, the Nazi, right, who had to quit the monarchy because he was so close to Hitler that it was a tremendous embarrassment for them. And lost there a little bit on the side is Edward VII's eldest son, the one that they called Prince Eddie, who is, I think, the most serious candidate to have been Jack the Ripper. But now, by the time we get to 1914, it's time for George V to show what he's made of. Right? This is the second son of Edward VII. So here's the situation. It's August 2nd, 1914, and things are getting really hot. There are mobilizations going on. Russia is mobilizing their army. Germany's mobilizing their army. France is about to mobilize their army, or actually they are already mobilizing. So everybody's moving towards war. And the big question is, will Britain be a part of the war? And if you were looking at this from the outside, you'd say, why, no, they're not an interested party, right? They have nothing to do with Serbia or anything like this, and they're probably going to stay out of it because that's their tradition of splendid isolation, right, that they used to have. Except that they're not. And here's the one key moment that illustrates this. We have other evidence that shows this, but this is a new piece of it. According to the London Daily Telegraph and the London Daily Mail, there has been discovered a bunch of papers in a private home which belong to the nephew of Sir Edward Grey, the Earl Grey, right, the British Foreign Secretary, the Foreign Minister in August 1914. So, and what this talks about is there's a certain amount of circumstantial detail how we get this, but the basic idea is that on August the 2nd, 1914, there was a meeting at Buckingham Palace between King George V, Emperor of India, right, just tremendously powerful monarch, and Edward Grey. And Edward Grey says to the king, I don't see how I can get England into the war. I just don't see it because, Englishmen don't care about Serbia. They don't know where it is. This is sort of the idea, right? They don't like Germany. They don't like Austria-Hungary, but still, it's not worth a war. And of course, the French and the Russians may think that this is worthwhile. But how do I sell this to the British public? So the king says to him, what he tells Sir Edward Grey is, you have got to find a reason, Grey. In other words, you have got to find a way to get into this war. And this is something not surprising to me, but in terms of most of the academic stuff, this is amazing. And I'll just read it to you because they're kind enough to show you the full text of this letter. So the idea is that this is now the nephew of Edward Grey goes to see the king in 1933 when Grey is dead and the king is getting old, and the king wants to comfort him and so forth. And the king tells the nephew of a meeting between King George V and Edward Grey 2 days before the outbreak of the war. In other words, August 2nd. It lasted for 1.5 hours, and the king said that Uncle Edward, Edward Grey, sat in the same chair that I was sitting in. He told me that Sir Edward Grey had said to him that he could not possibly see what justifiable reason England could find for going to war. His Majesty said in reply, quote, you have got to find a reason, Grey. And then he tells him why, right? Why find a reason, right? It's a catastrophe. He then said the king elaborated on this point, explaining that if England did not go to war, Germany would mop up France, and having dealt with the European situation, would proceed to obtain complete domination over England. And for that reason, the king felt that it was absolutely essential, think of it, absolutely essential, that whatever happened, England had to find a reason for entering the war. And that is what he told Uncle Edward. Now, the next day, the king says, continuing the story, the king got a letter from the president of France, Poincaré, saying, please, British, please join the war. That was one thing he got. And then he got a telegram from King Albert of Belgium, saying that the Germans were violating the Belgian frontier. And the king put these two together and sent them to Edward Grey, saying, here is the reason you were looking for, the Belgian neutrality, right? The horrors of the Boche in Belgium, and therefore you don't need to look any further. You've got the reason. Kind of interesting, huh?
History is fascinating.
Absolutely essential.
Yeah, it's totally amazing. Hold on, we'll come right back with Webster as we continue to take a look at some of the truly momentous events of their times, even though nobody heard about them. Behind the scenes, those smoke-filled rooms, as they say. Be right back. Okay, and let's get right back to our guest, Webster Griffin Tarpley, telling us really some inside stuff that I guarantee you'll never hear anywhere else. Go ahead, Webster.
Well, then, so I think just to get a quick overview, right, of what we know about this. First, in order to have World War I, you got to have these alliances. You got to have this triple entente, Britain controlling France and Russia as a nutcracker against Germany. Edward VII assembled this personally. He made the trips. He made the visits. He did the diplomacy, the pourparlers, whatever it is.
Well,
he also, it's his idea, right? He starts it. It doesn't come from the Foreign Office. It comes from Edward VII. He's the most successful political activist and operative of the House of Windsor. He's politically the most active British monarch going back to what? William the Conqueror. He's just, he's all over everything. And he also assembled, especially in France, but also in England, Russia, Italy, Spain, all over the place, a network. And when we refer to this Edward VII network, we can also refer to it as the Freemasonic lodges. And you can say that the way that World War I came about was that it was a union of the French Freemasonic Grand Orient with the Russian secret police, the infamous Okhrana. That's pretty much what brings you, for example, Sarajevo. That's pretty much it. And this union of the Grand Orient of France primarily, but also Italy, Spain, Portugal, Latin America, and the Okhrana, right, Russian intelligence, takes place under the auspices of the Scottish Rite Freemasons, which Edward VII is the head.
This is Russia before Bolshevism, folks.
But it's all over the place. And for example, this guy Clarence Henry Norman writes about this, that Freemasons before 1914. Now, some of these names are no longer household words, but they once were. Right? Poincaré, president of France. Combes, a top French politician. Delcasse, French foreign minister. Briand, right? That's the Kellogg-Briand Pact a little bit later. Viviani, French prime minister. Mitterrand. All of these are, and they even mention Mussolini, right? That Mussolini was a Freemason before he became a fascist. Once Mussolini took over as dictator, he crushed the Freemasons because he knew what they were and he didn't want their competition, so to speak. I think we've already gone through the fact that the news of the Sarajevo assassination was being eagerly awaited on that day, Sunday, June 28th, 1914, St. Vitus Day, right? Not St. Vitus Dance, but St. Vitus Day. So they're waiting for it in London, and they're waiting for it in St. Petersburg. I found that in the meantime. But how was it brought about? We could just look in briefly at the trial of the conspirators there, the ones who threw a bomb and then got the revolvers going and killed the Austrian Archduke and his wife. We have, the protocols of the court. We have the Q&A, the cross and the recross, and so forth. So here's the cross-examination of Princip. Princip is the guy who shot the Archduke and his...
Princip, not Princip. Okay, Princip.
Princip. It's Prince, right? I think sometimes with a K, sometimes with a Z. Princip. I think you can do that any way you want. It's sort of gray area.
What it was a pretty gruesome murder, and I understand that the carriage is still on display somewhere with the.
Unfortunately, the Serbs, in what I think is a terrible public relations mistake at this point, still insist that this guy was a hero who was fighting for their freedom. He was a psychotic patsy maneuvered by British and French Freemasonic groups. Now, one of the people on trial is a guy called Chabrinovich. And let me just read you this testimony. You'll get the idea. Even the names won't mean anything, but you'll get the idea. The defendant, Mr. Chabrinovich, was cross-examined. He said that the Freemasonic Lodge official who organized the murder was Dr. Radislav Kazimirovich. And so they ask him, who is this Kazimirovich? The answer from the defendant is, he is a Freemason, and in some ways one of their heads. He traveled off at once as soon as this group of young crazies decided to organize the assassination. Chabrinovich traveled the continent. He went to Budapest, Russia, and France. There are also stories that some of these killers were taken to Paris and perhaps even London. So anyway, whenever the local assassin asked his friends, when are we going to do the hit? The answer came, when Kazimirovich comes back. And the word was that the Freemasons had condemned the Archduke to death in 1912, but they couldn't find anybody to carry out the sentence. So therefore, this Chabrinovich...
What's all these Russian-sounding names?
Well, they're Serbs.
Oh, okay.
They're Serbs.
All right.
So it's a it's a Slavic language, with the Greek alphabet and so forth. Right? So so he gets a Browning automatic. He gets cartridges. The guy comes back from Budapest, and the word then is that man has come back. He had made connection with certain circles abroad. So the idea is that this is the Young Bosnia. Mm-hmm. So Young Bosnia would be a British organization. The key word is the young, right? As soon as it's young, it's Mazzini, right? Giuseppe Mazzini, British agent, Young Italy, Young Germany, Young France, Young England, Young America. I could go through a lot of stuff about all of these, but there they are. So that's the idea. So this was a setup, right? And we also have lots and lots of quotes from officials who say, oh, we're not ready for war in 1912, but France and Russia will be ready for war in 1914. So we have all that. There's also the element of propaganda. Let me just stress that Edward VII had recruited this guy Rothermere, Lord Northcliffe, and had essentially set up the London tabloids as we know them, right? And this was complete jingoism, anti-German hysteria. The Germans are coming by plane, by boat, by blimp, dirigible, whatever.
Yeah. Okay, this is very interesting. Hold on, we'll come right back and continue. Don't go away. Go right ahead.
Well, I guess then the other thing is the actual outbreak of the war, right? What we've just had in the past couple of days, right? These anniversaries, right? Mm-hmm. Different countries, different times. Here's the thing with Edward VII and company. If you go back and look at what things were like in 1912 and 1913, you conclude that British relations with Germany seem to be getting better and better and better. And this was deception. There had been, at the time of the Boer War, there had been an effort by Count Witte of Russia to organize France, Germany, Russia against the British, the so-called Continental Bloc, saying, why do we want to spend all this money on armies and hysteria? Why don't we simply solve our existing problems, right? There's nothing that can't be solved.
Our differences, that's right. Yeah.
And form a bloc against the British, the idea being the British are the real enemy. And there was interest in this in France because of the hatred over this Fashoda incident. In other words, the British had humiliated the French in southern Sudan, showing that the British were much more powerful through their control of the seas, and that they could essentially roll up the French colonial empire any way they wanted to. But the guy, interestingly enough, the guy who really blocked and sabotaged this continental alliance was William II of Germany. And he went around for the rest of his life saying, I am the one who saved the British in 1900 and 1901. Because in the Boer War, there was huge hatred of the British, right? They had the first concentration
deservedly camp. So, for God's sakes.
Sure. concentration camps and all this, right, for these Dutch.
Well, it genocided a hell of a lot of white Christian families and, the whole thing.
Yeah, of course, and whoever's in it, it's bad. But in this case, this was especially wild because of the racist, Anglo-Saxon hypocrisy that the British were pushing, and then they turn around and they unleash concentration camps precisely against people of this type. So what is it? What it shows is that the whole Anglo-Saxon identity trip is a fraud. All right, so you just have to understand British-German relations getting better and better, 1912, 1913, and they keep getting better until about 2 days before the war breaks out. And this is the interesting thing. Sir Edward Grey's posture in July of 1914, and into August even, was, I'm a mediator. I'm looking for peace. I'm not a party to this quarrel. I'm above it, and I'm trying to preserve the concert of Europe, as they used to say, right? So in this time, the British advance 4, not 1, not 2, not 3, but 4, count them 4, mediation proposals to Germany and to others. So this, you can see that this is a deception stance, so that the German government is convinced that if the big war comes, Britain will not be a part of it, right? They'll stay out. They won't come in and help France and Russia against Germany and Austria. And that is the big delusion. There's even a scene where the German foreign minister talks to his French counterpart, and the French counterpart says, you better back down because the British are going to support us. And the German guy says, oh, you have your information and we have ours. The British are going to stay out of it. Well, of course, it's complete nonsense. The French guy knows that there's a signed, detailed military convention that ever since 1906, under the auspices of Edward VII, and then continuing into the George V realm, that the British and the French, and then even the British and the Russians, work out these detailed military plans, general staff of the army and the admiralties of the respective navies, and they're all locked into these plans. So when you look at Edward Grey, he's a really important guy. He's a brand of tea. King Edward is a brand of cigars, right? So these guys, they're still around somehow. But in the case of Edward Grey, if he had wanted to avoid war, he would not have done this. He would have said to Germany, watch out, you get those Austrians to back down and leave Serbia alone, because if this comes to a big war, we're going to be in it, and that means your goose is cooked. So back down and get those Austrians to back down. So he does the opposite. He pretends to be a disinterested, benevolent mediator. The other side is the cliques in St. Petersburg and in Paris. You have in Russia a clique around the Tsar's uncle, Nikolai Nikolaevich, who wants war. He wants a general European war because he wants to take over the Straits, the Bosporus and the Dardanelles. He wants Constantinople, in effect. That's his program. So he's courting a general European war. On the French side, you have Poincaré, who is obsessed with this Alsace-Lorraine question. He wants these two provinces that the Germans had taken in 1871, right, at the time of the creation of United Germany. So these two groups are interested in a general European war. The Austrians, Vienna, they're interested in they want to crush Serbia because Serbia threatens their national unity, right? Serbia is always agitating that the South Slavs should form, what became then Yugoslavia a little bit later on, right? So the Austrians feel threatened. They just want to wipe out Serbia. That's really all they care about. And Germany really has no particular goal in this except that they don't want to lose Austria-Hungary, their only ally that they have left. So they're very devoted. They've got to follow these Austrians. And indeed, they've got to get the Austrians to put up an aggressive front because they think that's the best way to keep the Austrians close to them. This is a complicated issue. This is the people who blame Germany for starting the war generally start from these these messages you get from Berlin to Vienna saying, hang tough, guys. But this is simply, we're with you. Don't leave us in the lurch. Don't join the British. Don't listen to Sir Edward Grey and so forth. But then we get the British. What is it that they want? They're the ones that want a world war, not a local war in the Balkans, not even a general European war, but a world war. And when the British intervene, that's when it becomes a world war. So what they do all along is, instead of telling the British and the French, back off, we're not with you, you're on your own, they do the opposite. They're always saying, yes, we'll honor our commitments, right? And these are secret commitments. And then this brings us to this famous speech by Sir Edward Grey. On August 3rd, the day after this discussion that we've just gone through between Sir Edward Grey and the King, George V, he's got to get the House of Commons to declare war. And his dilemma is this. He's got to tell them, look, we have no choice because we have these secret military conventions, naval, military. We have a British expeditionary force. We have 160,000 men that at the point that he made the speech, were already moving to the ports to get on ships to go over to France. And they've also got the Royal Navy, which he had mobilized the day before. In other words, as soon as the king told him, you've got to find a way, Edward Grey went out and said, okay, I'm mobilizing the Royal Navy. I'm sending them to guard the French coast. So he's done two. He's mobilized the Army and the Navy. What more could you do in those days? So he goes into the House of Parliament, and he's got to say, look, we have no choice. We are committed. But on the other hand, there are no secret agreements. So he's got to say, you guys have to be loyal to the secret agreements which don't exist. And he does it. He threads the needle. And the thing that helps him, the way he gets out of it, is this thing about Belgium, that he says, the Germans have invaded Belgium. They're throwing babies from bayonet to bayonet. They're lining up nurses and machine gunning them.
About throwing babies out of incubators in Kuwait?
Yeah,
what's
exactly.
changed?
Nothing. And that's the whole point, is that what this shows you, I mean, when the king, just to get back to George V, right?
Yeah.
George V had personally told Prince Heinrich of Prussia on the 26th of July, 26th of July, had said to him, we're going to stay out of this. We're trying to mediate because we don't want to be involved, and we won't be involved. That's the 26th of July. Then on the 29th of July, he repeats the same thing in a telegram. He sends this to Prince Heinrich, who's a German admiral, and he says, look, we're not going to be involved in this, and I want to assure you that we're working for peace. Now, that's the one on the 29th is important because the first declaration of war was on the 28th of July. Austria-Hungary, unfortunately, declared war on Serbia. This is what they wanted, right? Mm-hmm. They said, you're responsible for this assassination. Yeah, we're coming after you. But almost 48 hours after that, or 24 hours at least, George V still sends another telegram, the second one, to Prince Heinrich saying, we want peace, we're not going to be in it. And then on August 2nd, he turns around and says, it's absolutely essential, we've got to get in at any cost, by any means, with any lie, with any subterfuge. So what this adds up to is a con job. In other words, this is what they call perfide Albion, that the British absolutely cannot be trusted, that they're deceitful and devious and all the rest. And I'm afraid that's a large part of the story which is being hidden, you see, because of the Anglophile media.
What you've just laid out is evidence of plenty that there was an extraordinary amount of intrigue going on all over the continent. That's
one
amazing.
other thing I should just mention, this idea of the scenario of an assassination in the Balkans was something that people had talked about for decades. Bismarck had warned against it. Bismarck said the next war is going to start with some stupid thing in the Balkans. Yeah. But the British had been churning out scenario novels. Right? There's one from the 1890s where the King of Bulgaria is assassinated, and that starts World War I. So it's a very well-known scenario. Right? It's a well-known gambit that these Freemasons of the Edward VII type are are putting forward.
Well,
so there we have it.
Well, that was really a fascinating walk through an incredibly forgotten and incredibly important piece of history. We just don't get it. Thank you for that.
Well, now you got it. So don't believe these. Don't believe Malaysian 17. No. Don't believe Syrian chemical weapons. Right?
No, for
remember
goodness
all
sakes,
this
no.
stuff.
Well, we've got it memorialized now in our archives. Thank you for that, Webster.
Okay.
All right. You be well.
Bye-bye.
Webster Tarpley. Yeah, we'll see you next month, Webster.